So for the next couple of weeks, we have a ton of stuff to cover. We are covering, poor Jude. We are covering the longest period over the course of our study. Today, especially, we are covering basically everything from 800 to 1200, a good solid 400 years of Christian history. And that's largely because I'm practically ignoring everything from like 500 to 800. Because not a whole heck of a lot is happening there theologically. This is the church basically treading water as all of these various invading forces are messing around with Rome. But we have a lot to cover today, and I also want to stress sort of like two poles of what we're dealing with. On the one hand, this is kind of the moment in time when Christianity is riding at its highest. This is where Christianity is imbued with its greatest level of power. Christianity is the dominant political force in Europe for this entire period and for the next 100 years or 200 years that we'll talk about next week. It is also kind of the darkest period in Christian history. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that that's causal. Christians are bad at power, is kind of the message of this lesson. We saw that when Constantine said, hey, Christians are now a legal, authoritative religion in Rome, some good things happened and some bad things happened. This is very much where all those bad things are going to start to become really, really obvious. That's not to say that it's all bad. Like, as with all of our lectures, we're going to see good and we're going to see bad here. But this is the period that we call the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, or the medieval period. And largely because Christianity had gotten so entrenched that it couldn't see what it was doing wrong at this point. It had become so institutionalized, so bound up with worldly power, that you no longer even had the sort of saving grace that we see in the Eastern Church, where it was like a separate entity from the empire, from the emperor, and therefore had sort of its own theological life. Power and faith were one and the same at this moment. That was really dangerous and had a lot of negative consequences. But let's start positive instead. The first guy I want to talk about is Charlemagne. Charlemagne, Charles the Great. On December 25th of 800, Pope Leo III, not to be confused with our awesome Pope Leo of a couple of sessions ago, crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor. And this was very much a huge sea change moment in the history of Christianity at that point. For the 300 years prior to this moment, Christianity had been dealing with a succession of, quote, barbarian emperors. Guys who were influenced by Arianism, or guys who were just interested in political power, who were sort of adopting the name of Roman emperor, but only in name only. Like, not acknowledging any other, powers in the Roman power structure, or just declaring themselves emperor and having no interest in the Romans whatsoever, or abolishing the sort of Roman system altogether. In this time, Christianity actually had a lot of sway, because most of these barbarian emperors were nominally Christian, but also because they were unreliable. Like, they were frequently murdered, or poisoned, or just gotten out of the way in various ways. So Christianity very much filled that power vacuum. And the papacy, especially, as we'll discuss in a little bit, sort of grew to fill that spot. And in some ways, this is the highest moment in that sort of development, where once the emperor was largely instrumental in deciding who the major religious leaders were going to be, who was going to be the Bishop of Constantinople or the Bishop of Rome. There was sort of cooperation there. Now the power has shifted. And now it is the Pope who decides who the emperor is going to be. He crowns Charlemagne in 800 as basically this sort of two-sided acknowledgement. On the one side, it is saying, we are still in the Roman Empire and we want to see the flourishing of the Roman Empire again, but now it is a Roman Empire subservient to Christianity. The Pope has final say over who the emperor is going to be. And for a little while, this actually works. Like, this is a really great system. This is what is known in medieval circles as the Carolingian Renaissance, a moment of surprising wealth, prosperity, and illumination, and succeeding after the Dark Ages and ushering in this medieval period. Charlemagne's a good guy. He is a champion of Christianity, and good Christianity, not like the corrupt, ugly Christianity we'll be talking about in a little while. He seemed to have a lot of good ideas as far as developing the faith and developing secular power at the same time. And over the course of Charlemagne's career, he expands to a fairly substantial empire as far as, the Western Roman Empire's leavings, this medieval Europe is concerned. You can see that basically all of France and a decent chunk of Germany and a bunch of northern Italy, stretching all the way down to Rome, is all under Charlemagne's auspices. And he acquires this territory through a combination of just sheer conquest, but also conversion. He will basically go up to new towns and say, hey, I am a Christian emperor, we are making a new Christian empire, will you join me? And a lot of people are on board for this. Everybody remembers the heyday of the Roman Empire. Those were the good old days. They're long past now, but we remember when, Rome was the greatest city in the world, the Roman Empire was the greatest power in the world, and this was when, Jesus flourished and when Christianity flourished. Therefore, let's get back to that. Let's make Europe great again. Now, Charlemagne dies, and it doesn't go so great afterwards. His immediate successor, his son, takes over the empire largely intact, but he has 3 sons, and they don't seem terribly interested in, sharing all that well. This is the result of that, after the wars and the ugliness. This is a relatively stable political, economic situation. The fact is the Carolingian Renaissance lasts for a good solid 55 years and then it's done. And while its echoes will remain and a lot of the good work that it's done will linger, it's very much a flash in the pan. And we return to a darker sort of structure. Now, the one thing that Charlemagne does do that absolutely sticks is he is a patron of scholars and of learning. Under Charlemagne, he establishes monasteries and cathedrals, or the early version of cathedrals, all throughout Europe. And these monasteries are simultaneously important places of religious learning, like the ones that we've talked about in England, which were sort of like these oases of theology in the midst of all this darkness. But at the same time, there were also places of some significant wealth, power, and they were defensible. Which was important at this point in time because there were a lot of enemies hanging around, enemies to both the power structures on the secular side, but also to Christianity generally. So Charlemagne founds these monasteries, and he very much emphasizes for the monasteries that these need to be places of scholarship, places where the Bible is still read, translated, and sort of interpreted, as well as places where the languages can be talked about and where just big theological issues can be discussed. Throughout the next 2 sessions, monasticism is going to be the driving force behind Christian theology. It is the monks who are very much at the forefront of what Christianity is becoming. And as should not surprise you, it'll be a monk who kicks off the Reformation too. So monasticism is very much going to be the cornerstone of everything we're talking about here. It is where all the change is going to happen. But the other thing we need to talk about after Charlemagne is feudalism. Feudalism is kind of an economic power structure, and while I don't want to get into the deep economic historical side, I do want to talk about some of the basic stuff that we need to know because it's going to inform the way that the world works at this point in time and the way that theology develops as a result. Feudalism is a very strictly tiered economic structure. There is no social mobility under feudalism. You have the peasants, who are basically nothing more than slaves. They just have a different name, and they're supposedly free, but under what circumstances? Because they're totally poor and totally devoted to their lords. They do most of the manual labor in this society. They are the ones who till the fields. They are the ones that grow your crops, and that is wealth at this point in time. Money is basically just a direct translation for food and farms at this point in history. Above that, you have knights, and these are small, low-level landholders. They typically will have an estate with a number of peasants on that estate. In fact, in certain cultures, especially in Russia, you will count the worth of your estate in terms of the number of peasants who live there. They are trained as soldiers, and that is their primary responsibility. The key here is because this is such a dangerous, tumultuous time, because there are enemies on all sides, and because there are these constant wars, and because lords are always trying to take land from other lords, what these lords are going to do is they're going to call up, they're going to muster their liege lords, their knights, their vassals. And all of these vassals are going to get all their armor, they're going to put it all on, they're going to get their horse, and they're going to get their squire, and they're going to muster their own army of servants, their serfs. They're going to arm the militia with their pitchforks and crappy weaponry, and they will go off and fight for their lord. Which brings us to tier 3, the lords. These guys are typically involved in all the decision making. These are the middle managers of feudalism, but they're much higher ranked. More like the CEO itself indebted to the king. These lords hold large areas of land. They have many knights under their service, many vassals, which means tons and tons of peasants and serfs. And the money all flows up. So the peasant is going to be farming their field, they will have all of their yield for the year. Most of that yield is going to go to their knight, which means that it will go to their lord, and the lord is then going to distribute it down. So the lord controls the money, and oftentimes they're the ones who are coining the money. They have most of the power in this situation, short of your king. And when I say king, that means king over a large territory. King of England, king of what would be called the Frankish world, or France at this point in time. Or naturally, your Holy Roman Emperor, if that's who you're immediately indebted to. So this is what the world of Europe is going to look like for most of what we're talking about here. The borders are going to change a little bit, we'll talk about it when it's relevant. But for the most part, we're talking about France and the Franks over here, and you will remember they have been the staunch allies of the Catholic Church for 300 years at this point. And Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire includes them initially, but they will break off because it's a different son than the one who controlled Germany by 1000 and afterwards. Here, this whole German, Italy, in the red boundaries, that's the Holy Roman Emperor. That is the holdings of the Holy Roman Empire, supposedly under the church, but frequently there's a lot of friction between the Holy Roman Empire and its secular leaders and the actual papacy and the church leaders on the other hand, which we'll talk about when we get there. You will also see multiple other kingdoms like Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, and the Duchy of Poland. These are individual kings with their individual lands, sympathetic to the church, but not under the control of the Pope or the direct other kings that we're dealing with in Western Europe. And then you've got England and Scotland and Ireland and all of our other normal major European powers. This is before these are nations in any sense. Your loyalty as a peasant at this point is to your knight, to your lord, and then to the king, but only distantly. If the king musters an army because somebody is invading, like there's a big fight between France and Germany, then it's going to be the king of France mustering all of his lords against the king of Germany, or the Holy Roman Emperor, and all of his lords. But most of the time, this is actually going to be petty fights between liege lords. They're going to be fighting over borders. They're going to be fighting over territories. So you will get mustered at the drop of a hat to do some stupid fighting for your middle managers. More often than you're going to actually fight for king and country. Country isn't even really a concept at this point in time. That's something that's going to develop in the hundreds of years after this. So don't think of this in terms of nations. The average serf in France does not think of himself as French. He thinks of himself as a servant to his lord and himself a servant to the French king. Got it? Now the dangers, the threats to this sort of roughly unified, roughly allied Christian world come from multiple directions. On the one hand, we have the Byzantines, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. They are still alive and kicking at this point. They are struggling. They are not nearly as powerful or as unified as they were under Justinian or any of the major emperors that we talked about last time. But they are still alive and kicking, and they are largely acting as a buffer state. Because remember, the Arabs and Islam has very much taken over the Middle East, Northern Africa, and the rest of the world beyond. So everyone in Europe knows that the Arab Muslim world is out there being a threat to Christianity at all times, but fortunately they've got the Byzantines largely between them, so it's not that big a deal until we get into the Crusades. But remember that the Arabs also swept through northern Africa and broke into Spain. So there is going to be a constant desire to take back Spain throughout this entire period. And we'll talk about that as well. But, in the same way that, propaganda posters will be like, beware the threat to your west. This is exactly what's happening. Anytime that the Pope is worried about, loyalty, he'll be like, guys, if we don't work together, the Moors and Spain are gonna, rip through Europe and we're all gonna die. Which is a huge exaggeration. The Arabs in Spain are actually not interested in doing that all that much. They have their own thing going on. But it's something that is always on the edge of our awareness. Part of the reason why feudalism is the dominant economic system is because it's enemies on all sides. They feel like they are cut off from the rest of the world. Trade is not possible at this period in time. The Mediterranean is not safe. The normal trade routes all go through enemy holdings. It is not okay to consider this a Christian world at this point. And as a result, your entire well-being comes from your land. That's it, the only source of income you have. And the threat to your actual land comes from the north. This is the time of the Vikings, the time of the Norsemen coming in and raiding all of your, land and fiefdoms. So if you live on the coast or if you live anywhere near a river, there is a decent chance that you will be raided by Vikings. And that means, again, you rely on your lord for protection, for security against Viking incursion or Viking invasion, as well as, just random robbers, raiders, and other people wandering around causing trouble at this point in time. So this is not a safe and stable world. There are threats on all sides. These people do not feel safe at any given moment. And yet, in this time, we have a number of sort of isolated outposts, especially those monasteries, that are producing new Christian ideas, that are trying to think through the old ideas, that are questioning the ideas that are in place at this moment. So that's the world we're looking at right now. And I realize that it's kind of complicated and very alien from our own, but maybe not as alien as we'd like to think. This is the setting for what we're talking about today. Now, the major force that we need to discuss is the papacy. We have talked about the Pope a couple of times here and there, not terribly often because it wasn't really a very thoroughly understood institution at this point in time. We talked about Leo I, who was kind of the first Pope, sort of. But again, the popes all draw their lineage from Peter, who was, according to Roman Catholics, the first Pope. The papacy becomes sort of the figurehead, the most obvious power structure, and the center of Christianity at this point in time. The Pope is both theological, ecclesiastical, churchly power, spiritual power, and worldly, secular, physical power. The Pope can muster armies. The Pope unifies Italy for a long period of time, but not all of the time. The Pope is a major player in all of these duels of kings and lords. The Pope has a lot of say. Because if the Pope says something like, Germany, you just offended me, and as a result, none of your sacraments will actually count until you fix this, that means that everybody in Germany is now in danger of eternal damnation. And they will get mad, and they will tell the Holy Roman Emperor to toe the Pope's line. And we're going to see that happen a few times. So we need to see the papacy, up until this point, it's not been this major player. We don't really see how we get from, the patriarchs of the churches or the high bishop in Rome to, Pope Benedict or Pope Francis or any of these major celebrity figures that we think of today. This is where that transition happens. The papacy goes from being just one bishop among many to the central bishop in the 500s to perhaps the most important Christian power in the world, or at least self-determined most important Christian power in the world, because you'll remember there's a lot of back and forth with the Eastern Church about this. To illustrate this, I want to show this wonderful little marble tablet. This is actually a picture of a tablet in St. Peter's Basilica. This is the official list of popes as of the 90s, I want to say. Like, this is a fairly old picture, so it does not include Benedict or Francis. But the dominant thing to keep in mind is this is the list of popes as they were buried in the basilica. So there are some significant omissions here. So you can see, like, there's a huge gap between Victor I, who died in 199, and then Leo I in 461, even though they're, like, back-to-back. That's because at that point in time, there wasn't any interest in burying your bishops of Rome in the basilica. It was not an institution at this point in time. You could bury them anywhere. Again, there was a lot of emphasis on the catacombs. During that period, you know, Christianity was not actually safe to practice a lot of the time. So, you know, you like scattered the corpses of your important figures to protect them from Roman authorities. But the one thing that I really want to draw attention to is how messy it gets in the 9th and 10th century. Like, this whole first column is literally everything from Peter at the top of the list to Benedictus II in 685. The second column goes from 686 to 999, 300 years. Half the time, the span going on here. And I'm going to talk about why. So, first off, like I've been stressing, the papacy has grown in power over the last 300 years, up until 800, when they decide, you know, look at us, we are powerful enough to determine the next Roman emperor. But it doesn't really know what to do with itself after it declares the emperor. The papacy has, for the most part, been this sort of like go-between for secular power structures and ecclesiastical power structures. It has very much filled the vacuum of consistency because Rome has been changing hands and Europe has been changing hands so frequently over those 300 years. But after Charlemagne is declared, it's like, okay, so we're done being a secular power, right? Wrong. Nobody gives up power. That's not how that works. The papacy has largely considered itself a major force. If it says, this country is being bad and therefore everybody hates them, let's go to war against them, then presumably they should be agreed with. But now somebody else is doing that job, I guess. The popes are not entirely sure where they're going to be from now on. Sure, they're the head of the church, but what is their relationship to worldly power, war, money, all of that stuff? Now, in this period, right around 867, we have Nicholas I. And Nicholas I is sneaky. He discovers all of these documents that say that the Pope actually has total civic authority over Italy. Like, the whole country is the Pope's. It is not to be considered in, like, the duels of France and the Holy Roman Empire or, like, other major players. Like, Italy is owned by the popes. They are both the secular power and the religious power. Now, these documents supposedly came from Constantine. There is no evidence to support that Constantine actually wrote them. In all likelihood, Nicholas just invented them. But they are kind of convenient, and they do keep Italy sort of well-behaved for a couple hundred years in there. But after John VIII in 882, which is right here, things get ugly fast. If the Carolingian Renaissance fell apart in like 50, 60 years, the papacy fell apart like 30 years after that. And in that period between 882 and, say, 1050, which is Leo IX, fourth from the top of the third column, you get pope after pope after pope after pope after pope after pope with these very short reigns. In fact, if you like study this really closely, you will see there's like 3 popes in 897 and 2 in 896 alone. This level of political craziness makes Game of Thrones look like America in the 1950s. Like, there is backstabbing, there are poisonings, there are like popes exhuming popes and retroactively like excommunicating them from the church for being anti-popes. Like, it is pure chaos for a good like couple dozen years there and beyond. Part of this is because Italy itself is in a really impressive state of chaos. The city of Rome is governed by a bunch of powerful families, and these families are actually like fighting over the papacy. Up until now, and through this period for the most part, we'll talk about where it changes, bishops have had the privilege of deciding who the next bishop is going to be. Like, that was set down a long time ago under Irenaeus. The papacy works the same way. Whoever the pope is gets to decide who the next pope is. So you can get a family dynasty building the papacy into their own interests. And of course, if that's what's going on, you will have other families really upset about it who are trying to change the hands. So there is a lot of chaos in the papacy during this period. And it is some ugly, ugly time. Definitely not befitting what Christianity should look like, and it's even at its worst. This is just bad and wrong. And I want to stress, the papacy is not to be relied upon during this period. There are good popes and there are bad popes. Every now and again you will see somebody who reigns for a long time and does a lot of good. It happens. But because the papacy is bound up with secular power, with nepotism, with money, it gets all of the ugliness that those things tend to bring about. And as a result, it's a mess for a good 150 years. And we'll talk about as it changes when we get there. Now the other thing I want to stress is that a lot of this is happening simultaneously. Like, you'll notice on our worksheet I put dates on all of the sections because they all overlap. The whole mess with the papacy is going to be going on at the same time as our theological disputes and our monasticism discussion and the reforms and everything that's happening. So just keep in mind, I can't present this chronologically. There's too much going on and there's just too many different fields. So I want to hit it topically. So we have Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance sort of kicking off all this change. We have the papacy becoming a giant mess. And while that's happening, the real sort of stability in Christianity is happening in monasticism. We talked briefly a couple of sessions ago about Benedict of Nursia being the guy to bring monasticism from the east to the west. Now we need to talk about him a little bit more, because he is going to be setting sort of the tone for what the monks are going to be doing and how monasteries are going to look throughout this entire period and beyond. So Benedict of Nursia was born in Nursia in 480. He very much founded the first proper Western monastery at Monte Cassino. He's both the abbot of this monastery and also very much the founder of the way that monasticism is going to work across the board. He writes The Rule of Benedict, which is a book that every monk keeps on their person at all times, or if they do not own it for various reasons, then it is something that they refer to, memorize, and constantly follow. This is as important to them as the Westminster Confession is to the Reformed Christians, or the way that the Common Book of Prayer was important to the Puritans. This is the book that they lived by, though it does not contradict or conflict with the Bible whatsoever. And the emphasis that Benedict emphasizes a couple of different things, which very much shapes the way that monasticism is going to look. So first off, he wants the monks to be stable. Monks are not allowed to wander from monastery to monastery. Wherever you show up, wherever you decide to hang out, you stay there. Which means you actually have a surprising amount of longevity, because the monk is well protected. It is under the Pope's protection. It has a decent amount of wealth and a decent amount of land, which, as you'll remember, it's feudalism. Land equals money. And since the monastery has land, it therefore has money. It can protect, basically, its monks and keep them fairly safe from invaders. Although they are also a popular target for the exact same reasons, and Vikings will totally raid monasteries frequently throughout this period, just that everybody then goes back and it's like business as usual. The other thing that he emphasizes is obedience. Monks are subservient to their abbot, to the rule as it is written down by Benedict, and of course to God. But this is not a free society. This is what your abbot says you do. If that means penance, you do penance. If that means confession, you do confession. If that means hard work, you do hard work. If that means isolation in your cell for long periods of time while you are praying, that's what you do. What he says goes. This is absolute. And unfortunately, most of the abbots tend to take this responsibility fairly deeply, and again, they are subservient to the rule and to God, so there is, obviously accountability here, but for the most part, your monk is going to not consider themselves important enough to, get uppity or to revolt against their abbot. There are no reported revolts in monasteries that I know for all of this sort of apparent tyranny. And this works at the end of the day. The next thing that it very much emphasizes is you don't want to get too big for your boots. The monasteries are not supposed to become like casinos. They're not supposed to be huge centers of opulence and wealth on display. Instead, monasteries are supposed to give that wealth to the community, and they frequently do. If you are living in a village near a monastery, you are probably going to do better than most of the other villagers in the relative area, because the monks are going to be generous, they're going to help you. There are places of learning, which means that they will tend your sick. They typically specialize in medicine, especially for the surrounding area. But it's not strict poverty. You'll remember when we talked about Eastern monasticism, it was all these hermits living out in the desert, like scraping for their meals and fasting for weeks on end and like weaving baskets for the limited income that they have. That's not how it works under the rule of Benedict. There are limited means, but you still can expect to have 2 meals a day, along with wine in most cases. Many monasteries become vineyards as well because they've got the land and they've got the leisure to actually make it, which, you know, it turns out is very lucrative. And they don't have to worry about like basic food needs in most cases because they will talk to the community for that. So this kind of works out. Like the monks aren't living it up, but they also aren't destitute. The idea of the mendicant monk, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans, isn't something that's going to come about until next week's lecture. So keep that sort of separate. The idea of like taking a vow of poverty is not what Benedict is insisting upon here. It is, you're in a community, you are subservient to that community, you need to not like overextend yourself, but at the same time, you're going to be comfortable while you are here. Now, the next thing that Benedict emphasizes is your monks have work for their keep. And this is pretty hard. Like, we're talking about they're going to be tending the fields, they're going to be doing hard manual labor. It is not all copying texts, although a lot of it is copying texts. And it is also kind of backbreaking, like, tiring work. But this is actually one of those things that Benedict thoroughly emphasizes, like, every good Christian should work for their bread. And then it kind of just falls away over the course of time as monasteries become better known and more important and have sort of different emphases thrust upon them. So manual labor is initially part of the plan. It kind of falls off by the end as monks become sort of more important to the society as a whole. But that means that an abbot can at any time say, hey, you annoyed me, so now you're going to work the fields for the next few days. And typically young monks who haven't proven themselves, guess where they end up for the first few years of their tenure as a monk. Now, the next thing that he stresses is there is a very, very rigorous schedule of prayer. Like, I want to say that in certain groups and at certain times, it gets up to like 12 times a day, everybody just breaks, stops, and they all get together in the chapel and pray. This schedule is just tirelessly rigorous. It is very strict. There are reasons why monasteries have bell towers. When you ring the bells, it's time for Vespers, or it's time for Noctis, and you come and you pray. And some of this is not at convenient times either. You pray before you have breakfast, you pray after you have breakfast, you pray before you have lunch, you pray after you have lunch, you pray in the mid-afternoon, you pray before dinner, you pray after dinner, and then in the middle of the night, the bell will wake you up and you will all go and you will all pray at midnight. Like, it's tough. There is a lot of praying going on. And it is a lot of communal, grouped prayer. Like, this is not praying as we frequently understand it as Protestants, where you like go in your own corner and you just, talk to God all by yourself. This is under the sort of direct supervision of your abbot, because again, everybody is there. The only exceptions are whoever is like on guard at that point, or if there's a really important job that needs to be done. Otherwise, literally everyone will meet at this hour. And Viking raids tend to be super successful if they manage to hit at the prayer hour. Because nobody is watching the place, and if you can get your couple of guards, it's easy peasy, you can just capture them all in one place. So this is the idea behind monasticism, and this is very much what unifies all of the various Benedictine monks at this time. But during this time period, it also kind of grows beyond that. In the Middle Ages, monasticism doesn't look exactly the way Benedict originally envisioned it, because the needs on the monks are changing. The world is changing around them, and they are changing to suit that. Monasticism has proved extremely adaptable. fitting whatever Christianity needs at any moment in time. So in the Middle Ages, rather than being focused on the manual labor, it becomes much more focused on scholarship. During the Middle Ages, monasteries became like Bible factories. Frequently, monks were assigned to copy large texts of the Bible over long periods of time. Because remember, this is before the printing press. This is the only way you get new Bibles, is if somebody is like painstakingly copying it line by line over long periods of time. This actually creates some fairly hilarious situations. Like, you can see old monastic manuscripts of like people who got sidetracked or distracted, or like they make huge glaring mistakes that then get propagated because the same book is being copied by other monks down the line. One of my favorite stories, there's like this great picture of like an old medieval monk transcribed manuscript where there's this whole blank page with a huge ugly stain on it. And the monk has written in the margin, "Damn the cat that peed on my book while it was open." These things happen. It's kind of an ugly mess. But keep in mind, this is a really important function. Every parish is supposed to have their own Bible. And if your Bible gets stolen by Vikings because it was illuminated with gold, which is frequently what they will do, then that means you need a new Bible, which means that these monks are constantly working to make new Bibles and make sure that everybody gets these Bibles and make sure that every parish in the land can properly keep up with this. And that's in addition to any other texts that you want to copy. So all those like 2 surviving texts of Plato, or all of those books by Augustine, or all the books by Tertullian, or any of the other stuff that we've talked about in this class, the only way that it survived to the point that we get to talk about it today as something that like we can read and find on the internet is because these guys were painstakingly copying those texts over and over and over again. And while Bibles clearly had the major precedence, a lot of monks went out of their way to protect these texts during what little bit of free time they had, because they thought it was important, because this was a huge priority for the medieval world. But the other side of this is that these monks are also kind of indebted and enslaved to these texts. Their purpose as scholars is not to pave the way or question or do any of the things we usually think of academia doing today. Their job was to preserve, which meant not question the rules, not questioning their abbot, making sure the tradition keeps going, because it is under constant threat. It is a lot of work just to keep it going at this point in time. So when people talk about like how backwards or dogmatic the medieval period is, part of that is by necessity. The danger of losing it is way greater than the danger of any kind of overemphasis on the papacy or the other institutions that are at play in here. This is a lot of work. And it is a very necessary business. Now, the next thing that I want to emphasize is that these monasteries quickly grew in size and in their holdings. Frequently, monasteries had their own army of peasants, their own army of servants, their own vineyards, their own fields. Like, monasteries would take over large areas, and often this was a good thing because it meant that now they were under the protection of the monks and therefore the church. But again, power and Christianity don't mix, which means that now the same problems that are attending the papacy, namely nepotism and people trying to get the position to increase their power or their wealth, are happening in monasteries as well. Being the abbot of a prominent monastery is a lucrative, comfortable position. And a lot of noble families will go out of their way to install like their lesser sons who they don't want marrying and carrying off their holdings into abbots or into abbeys to get them out of the way very conveniently and also retain their political power and privilege. So there's 2 sides to that. Now, the other thing that they are very much sort of doing is they are separate from the papacy. Their accountability is different from whatever the Pope is doing at any given moment, which means that they frequently form a theological counterpoint to whatever's happening in the papacy, and it's going to be the monks who get angriest about papal abuses, as we'll talk about in a little bit. They are very much isolated, and they are very much closeted with the Bible at all times. So they're constantly going to that well, rather than the popes, who are frequently corrupt or involved in this whole money-making scheme, and therefore they've got their own mess to deal with. But the last thing that's super important about the monks is that they see themselves as one community in a world where there are no nations, where loyalty is very, very limited. You can be a monk at any monastery in Europe at this point in time and have the same perspective because you follow the same rules, you live under the same conditions, you've read the same texts, and as a result, these monastery communities are constantly sending letters to each other, and they're constantly making friends with one another, and they're constantly talking in a world that has very much stopped being able to do communication over long distances. Which means, again, it's going to be a place where a lot of interesting theological things are going to happen, and a lot of where change is going to take place. They see themselves as one nation, under Benedict, under their abbots, under God. And that makes them powerful in a weird and backwards sort of way, but a way that's actually a lot more in line with the way that the Bible teaches. They are servants leading through their servitude. So I have a lot of respect for the monks, as much as they're kind of a mess and there's also a lot of corruption there as well. But let's talk about some of these major theological issues, because not a whole lot is changing, and it's certainly not as rapid as we're going to see with the Reformation, or as we have seen in the early centuries of the church. But there are a couple of really interesting conversations going on at this point, and all of these letters flying back and forth between the monks. The first one that I do want to sort of bring up but not dwell on too much is this idea of adoptionism. This is not a heresy, so to speak, because it never actually gets off the ground. But there is an idea floating around among a lot of the monks that the reason why Christ is God's son is because Christ was adopted. It is a convenient solution to a lot of theological problems, like trying to explain exactly how God begot Christ from Mary is messy, and we're going to be dealing with some of that in a moment. So there is a movement to sort of say that God didn't necessarily beget Christ, he adopted him, which is not what the Bible says, and is very much sort of out of sync with a lot of what the church has been saying. So this one gets quashed pretty quickly. But it does come up, and it does get discussed, and I did want to sort of raise it as an example of some of these monks being out on their own, being separated from the rest of the world, come up with some fairly crazy ideas. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are just completely unhinged. This might be in the unhinged territory, or at least borderline unhinged territory. But what I also want to stress is that it self-corrects. All the abbots who see this letter are like, no, that's not how it works. Shut up. Who is the abbot in charge of that monastery? Give him extra hours. He obviously should not have free time to write. This fixes itself in a very real sense. But let's talk about some of the more interesting and more productive directions that this takes. You remember last time we talked about Augustine and this whole idea of predestination versus foreknowledge. How are we saved? Are we saved because God requires us to be saved, forces us to be saved through his completely unperturbable grace, or does he just see us getting saved the way that whole synod of Orange ultimately decided in the whole Pelagian, semi-Pelagian mess? This is a conversation that doesn't stop when the Pelagians kind of go away. The monks pick it up. And this is one that really doesn't come to a definitive conclusion. A lot of people back Augustine, and they go with this hard predestination. Grace is not something that you can fight against. God wills that you become saved, and therefore you are saved. But there is some pushback. Other monks are saying, hey, what if it's the foreknowledge thing? What if God just sees that you are saved, and therefore just makes it come about because he knows that you would be saved under these circumstances, giving God a more passive role and you a more active role. There's pushback on either side, and this one does not really come to any conclusions. A lot of these discussions are sort of just floated, and then just other scholars are going to carry the baton later, especially in the 13th century with scholasticism. But this is one of the ones that a lot of conversations are being had about at this point in time. And there are a certain couple of punk monks who keep writing lots of letters just causing trouble and getting this discussed all over the place. One in particular that I kept running across in Gonzales, it seemed like he could not just agree with anyone. He was just writing, he must have hated his abbot or something, just writing mean letters every chance he got. But this is one of those where he was absolutely being a pain in the butt, but I think he was actually on the predestination side on this one. He was defending Augustine, which goes to show that sometimes the weirdo actually knows what he's talking about. Now the next one I want to discuss is one that we've probably all been waiting for. Let's talk about Mary. So I realize that we as Protestants thumb our nose at those Catholics and their weird love of Mary. What I want to stress is that as much as you would think that this is the period where all that happened, it really wasn't. We talked a little bit a while ago, during the Arian heresy, about Mary Theotokos, Mary the bearer of God, which was decided that is totally a legitimate name for Mary, not because of who Mary is, but because of who Jesus is, and therefore that's legitimate. This is the second major part of Marian theology, and it's very much being discussed at this moment. The idea here is that Mary is perpetually a virgin. Now, I had mentally brought this up with my wife last night as we were going over the PowerPoint. She's like, but Mary had other kids! But Catholics do not think that that's what happened. That passage where Jesus is like, do you see how my brothers and sisters do not pay attention to me? This is supposedly his brothers and sisters spiritually, not his physical brothers and sisters by Catholic interpretation. So they don't see Mary as ever having other kids. And in fact, when this discussion is happening, the discussion is, did Mary stay a virgin through the process of giving birth to Jesus? Which I do not want to inquire about the mechanics too deeply, because this is an ugly sort of business. But if you can have miraculous births from no conception, or if you have like Sarah and Abraham having a kid after she's hit menopause, presumably you can also have Jesus teleporting out of Mary into whatever. And this is a serious conversation that the monks are having, and this actually becomes Catholic doctrine. To this day, you talk to Catholics, and they believe that Mary is, and always was, a virgin, from birth to death, including the process by which she had Jesus. This becomes canon. So just keep that in mind. Like, the other stuff that we hear about Mary, like the whole Immaculate Conception discussion, that's for another day. And in fact, not in this part of the class. We're not going to get there until the 19th century. But a lot of these Mary discussions are starting to get kicked around at this point in time. We are having some theological debate, and these ideas are sort of in their nascent stages as the monks are trying to figure out how women work. And if it's not obvious, the problems that they're going to run into. Yeah. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Eucharist. Here is another one of those big marquee Catholic doctrines that we tend to get frustrated about, namely transubstantiation. Transubstantiation, if you are not familiar, the idea is when you take communion, the bread and the wine literally turns, either on your tongue or in some part of the process, into the flesh of Christ and the blood of Christ. Like, you are not eating bread and drinking wine, you are eating flesh and drinking blood. And this is not official Catholic doctrine at this point in time. The Eucharist transubstantiation discussion will not get codified until the 13th century, but this is where a lot of this is taking place. A lot of the conversation is taking place. And what you will notice if you hang out and read all these monks' letters is they mostly assume that it's true. They do not see the Eucharist as being symbolic. Even as early as the 9th and 10th century, monks are pretty much in agreement that transubstantiation is something that happens physically. It is not purely nominal or symbolic. The bread is literally changing into flesh, the wine is literally changing into blood. Now they're just frequently discussing exactly how that works. Like, you know, you get into these ugly Catholic discussions about like, all right, so if I like spit out the bread, is it still Jesus? Or like if, you know, somebody steals a wafer from your tongue and then performs like a horrible ritual on it, are they like doing something bad to Jesus' body? These conversations are exactly what the monks are talking about in many cases. They're trying to explore all possible situations. Like, I know that we tend to think of medieval scholars as being like backwards and weird, but really they're actually super rigorous, and they are exploring all these crazy outsized possibilities because they do have major theological consequences. So again, the doctrine of transubstantiation is very much being hashed out at this point in time. Although, and while, you know, a lot of it is in fact assumed, the actual details have not been sorted out at this point. But the major thing on everybody's mind, the major discussion that all of the monks are having at this point in time is the same one we've been having since Tertullian. How does philosophy and religion work together? How does our reason complement our faith or vice versa? And the monks are really engaged in this conversation. This is one that everybody weighs in on. This is where the major treatises are frequently coming out talking about. And this is something that's absolutely going to have huge effects over the next 100 years, and in the Renaissance, and the Reformation, and beyond. So this is the one to remember. Like, as much as I definitely want to talk about like the high-profile Catholic doctrines that we don't agree with, At the same time, I want to stress that this conversation has been happening for like 1,200 years at this point, and is going to keep happening for the next 800 and change. And a couple of highlights that I want to talk about this reason versus revelation conversation, this where does faith, where does reason fit into this discussion. The first is Anselm of Canterbury. We're going to talk about him again more next week, because he has a lot of sort of like push and pull with the scholastics. But Anselm comes up with this new argument for the existence of God, and it is predicated entirely on reason. His argument, and this is one that I teach to my philosophy students, so I apologize if it's like super esoteric or abstract. Anselm says, I want you to imagine a being than which no greater being can be thought. What is the greatest being you can imagine? And Anselm says, okay, you've got this idea. Now I want you to ask, does that greatest being you imagined exist in reality, or does it not exist in reality? And what Anselm says is, if you were imagining the greatest being that could ever be, but it doesn't exist, then it's not the greatest being possible. You need to imagine a greater being that does exist, because existence is better than not existing. Therefore, God must necessarily exist. No question. It is part of God's nature. The very concept of God requires that we believe that God exists. Because if we imagine a God who doesn't exist, it's not God. God is perfect. God is the greatest being conceivable. So if you can imagine a greater being, a being with all the attributes of God that does exist, that's God, and your earlier idea was wrong. But the reason why I'm stressing this here, like when I do it to my philosophy students, is because they need to know, and I'm going to totally like put a question on the final exam about it. The reason why I stress it here is because notice how this has zero to do with the Bible. His argument is 100% grounded in his rationality alone. And Anselm is coming down very hard on the side of reason as being a support for and basis for revelation. He is saying, my faith isn't necessarily predicated on my reason, but my faith is strengthened by my reason. My faith is not dependent on it, but my faith absolutely dovetails with it and is built up by it. He actually frames the whole proslogion where he writes this argument as a prayer, saying, let me use my reason to back up, justify, defend my faith. And increasingly medieval scholars are inclined to do this. As they're rubbing elbows with people who don't believe the same thing as they do, specifically Arabs and people from the Muslim faith, they're noticing that, like, if you try and talk New Testament with an Arab Muslim, they're not going to be interested in it. But if you talk reason with them, they will listen. So therefore, many are arguing that evangelism should be conducted through reason and not revelation, because people are listening to reason. Everybody's reason is the same, regardless of whether you're Christian, pagan, Viking, Muslim, or otherwise. And Anselm is very hard on the reason side of this debate. Anselm will absolutely bring in his philosophers to talk about faith. Others will disagree with him. But the other one I want to talk about, and this one's kind of like especially interesting, is Abelard, who was another monk at this time. And you probably, if you have heard of Abelard, you know of Abelard because of Abelard and Heloise. Heloise was a woman that Abelard fell in love with. And now, if it isn't entirely obvious, the monks are very celibate. They do not do women, they do not do sex. So the fact that Abelard fell for Heloise while a monk, and did in fact consummate their relationship, caused a lot of problems for Abelard, and very much sort of like detracts from his authority as a monk as far as the world is concerned. In fact, the story goes that after they hooked up, a bunch of monks took Abelard and castrated him to prevent this from ever happening again. Fun fact, didn't work. They retained a correspondence by mail for many, many years, and until they died, like they were writing love letters to one another. Yeah, it's kind of tragic, and it's kind of great, and it's kind of not great, and it's just a giant mess. But I do want to sort of dwell on Abelard for a bit. Not because of his huge, like, importance to the whole Christian tradition. Like, he writes a couple of important texts, especially this Yes or No, which I want to talk about in a bit. But I want to stress that Abelard is very representative of what it's like to be a Christian at this point in history. It is not perfect. It is ugly. You are being beset with temptations on all sides, whether physical or like wealth or any number of other things. And I think Abelard does the best he can under his circumstances. Like, he's a passionate, angry young man, for sure, as many passionate, angry young men have been. And I say that knowing full well that he's like a passionate, angry young man until he's like 65. But at the same time, like, he was very much a check to a lot of the power structures at his time. He was a revolutionary in his way. Now, he had tons of debates with people. Like, his abbot hated him all the time. There are multiple occasions where Abelard will pen this, like, profound theological treatise, and he'll be like, here it is, abbot, I wrote it for you. And the abbot will read it and be like, this is, oh my gosh, why do you keep doing this? And he will systematically burn all copies of it, and it will be completely destroyed, and we will never have it. Like, people will talk about it because it was a big deal at its time, but it will be excoriated from the canon. One of the treatises that does survive is this Yes and No. And this is actually probably the most important of his treatises in some ways. Not because of what he says, but because of the way that he says it. In Yes and No, Abelard, instead of doing the typical medieval treatise of like talking about like, here are my ideas, and these are all these good ideas, and here's what this person has to say about it, Abelard pits the Christian tradition against each other. He says, let's talk about those serious philosophical questions we've been dealing with. Let's talk about adoption. Let's talk about marriage. Let's talk about predestination and foreknowledge. Here are all the people who think that God chooses people by predestination. Here are all the people who think that God uses foreknowledge to decide who is the elect. And that's it. He will not weigh in. He just lets them sit. Here are the yeses, here are the nos. And what Abelard is very much stressing, which is very new to the medieval canon, is that Christian tradition disagrees. There are saints on many different sides of many different issues. And what I think he's most stressing is that that's okay. We can disagree. Like, I stressed early on in the class that like orthodoxy was this idea that like all Christianity was largely on the same page despite their differing views, despite their differing opinions. That's why we have four Gospels. They don't all 100% agree, although they do not contradict. And therefore, having multiple perspectives informs our faith and strengthens it. Abelard is doing the same thing. He is saying, here are all the people who say yes, here are all the people who say no. Some of them are probably wrong, some of them are probably right, some of them may be wrong for the right reasons, and some may be right for the wrong reasons. Who knows? Here they are. Not my place to judge. Now, as it happens, other theological scholars are going to run away with this format. And in fact, like the next guy who does it is going to write his sentences, where he's going to basically do the same thing. Here are all the yeses, here are all the nos, but then he's going to say, and this is the right answer. Based on what these people said, because these people had the better argument than these people, for whatever reason. This is actually going to become the way that everybody does scholarship for the next 200 years. Scholasticism is going to be based on these sentences. And in fact, like every scholar in the monastic communities is going to basically have to write their own version of the sentences to sort of prove that they are a decent scholar, the same way that you do like a dissertation as a PhD student nowadays. This is like the gate to entry. So all of the great scholastic scholars like Scotus or Thomas Aquinas, they all have their sentences, which they like did for their abbots once upon a time before they wrote their big works. And Abelard is very much in the DNA of the sentences, because Abelard had this idea before the sentences were even written. But Abelard's is different, because he doesn't weigh in. He just attributes equal attention to both sides. I think that's striking. I think Abelard has given us something important that we frequently overlook as a result. But the last really important thing I want to talk about for this whole reason versus revelation discussion is that this is where Aristotle shows up again. We have been ignoring Aristotle for like a long period of time because he wasn't terribly important to the Eastern scholars, and he was like kind of brought in and kind of not brought in by various of our early Western scholars. But importantly, during this period of time, Aristotle was lost. Like during this whole medieval period, Rome does not have copies of Plato and Aristotle in the original Greek. They have a couple of texts of Plato, just one or two, the Timaeus is one of them. They have multiple people quoting them, like everybody knows Aristotle because of Boetius. I think they might have had Aristotle's Analytics, like some people seem to have it, some people don't, or at least it's like really well documented in some other Christian writer. But at this point in time, during the process of reconquering Spain, they stumble across a library and they stumble across the Arabic and Greek texts of both Plato and Aristotle, and immediately monks start to get to work translating it. And as a result, Aristotle is gradually going to work its way into the theological circles and have a profound impact on what the 13th century thinks about theology, which will in turn inspire backlash during the Renaissance. So keep in mind, this project starts here. And people are starting to talk about how does Aristotle fit with what we believe, because now Aristotle is the hot new thing that everyone is talking about. So in the process of this reason versus revelation discussion, which was already going on, now you have one of the most important proponents of human reason in all of history. And that will definitely throw new light on things. But before we can talk about the 13th century, which is going to be for next week, we need to continue talking about the crazy stuff going on in the medieval period, and that means we have to talk about the Crusades. If you thought the papacy Game of Thrones version was bad, the Crusades are a giant nightmare of Christians behaving hypocritically and badly. I really want to stress, because there are still, to this day, various romanticized notions of what the Crusades are doing. It's these holy war against the infidel. No. Let me just dispel that right now. The Crusades are, at best, a giant, well-intentioned nightmare of bureaucratic ugliness and human sin on display, and at worst, they are perhaps one of the most destructive things that our faith has ever done, and it stands as a stain on what Christianity could be to this very day, and will continue to do so. The First Crusade, to give you an idea of what we're dealing with here, part of the reason why we had a crusade was the Pope at the time, Urban II, was dealing with an anti-pope, and to sort of affirm his true authority as Pope, he said, I'm going to muster an army and we're going to go retake Jerusalem. That's our big plan. Urban II is going to be known as the Pope that brought Jerusalem back into Christendom. The foundation of Christianity, Urban II is the guy who took it. So already we have selfish, powerful motivations, which is ugly. Even though, of course, as we saw with Augustine, it's under the auspices of, we're taking back what is rightfully ours. We are the Christians, we are the true, inheritors of the promise, therefore Jerusalem belongs to us. So we have that whole Augustinian just war thing, the boxes are all checked, kind of. But to do this, Urban II offers a fairly unprecedented new incentive. He says, I'm going to offer plenary indulgences to anyone who participates in our big crusade. And what that means is that anyone who goes and kills Muslims to take over Jerusalem gets a free pass into heaven, because the Pope said so. Which means no matter what you do on the way to Jerusalem, whatever sins you commit, we're going to look the other way, and we're not going to pay any attention because you did a great service for the Pope. And that gives the Crusaders license to do some really horrible crap. The First Crusade does not start with, everybody sails on a boat over to the Holy Land and they immediately start taking over lands. No, they have to get there first. So let me show you what we're dealing with. Here is a giant map of all four Crusades. The one that we're focusing on now is the First Crusade. That's the dotted line you see going from the top of the Holy Roman Empire down to Jerusalem, from Genoa and from Venice and from Lyon. Notice these are land crusades. They go walking over Europe to get to the Holy Land. They walk through basically all of what is now Austria and Hungary. They walk through basically all of Italy. They walk through a ton of Greece. They get to what you will remember is the Christian Byzantine Empire. They walk through that all the way down to Damascus and an Arab-controlled land. While they are doing this, they are hungry. Where do you get food from when you are an army on the march? You take it from wherever you happen to be. And if people get in your way, you've got plenary indulgences, so no big deal if you murder the peasants in the countryside as you go. Because you get that free pass when you take over Jerusalem, thank you from the Pope. And they do. They destroy tons of territory. Kings will shut their walls against crusaders rather than give them food because they know that the crusaders will come in and loot the place if given half a chance. Frequently, this gets bound up with anti-Semitism. Jewish communities who are trying to live off the land, they will just rape, sack, and pillage their way through these communities because, again, who cares? We've got plenary indulgences. Once we get to Jerusalem, all is forgiven, all is forgotten. So they basically do as much damage or more to Europe as they do to the Holy Land once they actually get there. Now the good news is they do in fact conquer Jerusalem. Mission accomplished. Hooray. In the process, they take over a whole bunch of other territory, and frequently, rather than turning it back over to the Pope or the Patriarch of Constantinople, they just keep it. Like, I took this city, now it's mine. So we end up with all of these random liege lords hanging out in the Holy Land, which is just another giant political nightmare, which will ultimately, really boil over in a few moments when we talk about the Fourth Crusade. But importantly, all the Crusades are going to look like this, at best. Because the other side of the Crusades is, this is constant. Like, we talk about there being 4 major Crusades, during these particular periods, and that's kind of silly. It's basically from the moment that Urban II says, we're going to have a crusade, to the time of the Fourth Crusade, concluding with the conquest of Constantinople, it's just going to be constantly. People are going to be going out there, in groups or alone. Pilgrims are going to be wandering over to Jerusalem to defend the cause or to fight for Christianity, and it's very disorganized. The First Crusade isn't actually the guys in the armor and the knights. The reason why the guys in armor are basically rejected by so many cities in Europe is because another crusade actually already came through. They wrecked the place, and it was just a bunch of disorganized peasants with no leadership. They were just like, let's go.
I'm sorry, I just want to ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Am I allowed to do that?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm just really curious. So these popes actually themselves believe they have the power to, say you can go to heaven if you do this. They actually believe that. And then the people actually believe it, or is it just more, abstract in that? They actually believe that that is.
In most cases, the Pope believes that they have the authority. Like Urban II believes that he has inherited the keys from Peter, direct line of succession, all the way down from all those popes, which means that what Peter binds in heaven, or binds on earth, will be bound in heaven, and what Peter looses on earth will be loosed in heaven. If Urban II says this guy goes to heaven, that guy goes to heaven, according to what he believes. Now, whether he had selfish motivations is another matter. He probably did. It's probably hypocritical on that level. As for what it means on the serfs level, the people who are actually doing the fighting, honestly, I think they did believe this. I think they'd be crazy to go if they didn't. This is the biggest boondoggle in the entirety of medieval history. Everyone who sees this knows that it's a joke. You are giving up what little amount of security and well-being you have to go into a place where you're going to be surrounded by enemies. You're going to just be in danger of your life at all times. Numerous people who join the Crusades are the ugly lords who have no chance of a good life where they are. This is the best case scenario for them. Or they've done something horrible in their past, and it now doesn't matter because plenary indulgences. As much as I want to criticize medieval Europe for being dogmatic and for doing horrible things, they had faith like you wouldn't believe. Down to the ground level, every peasant and serf took what the Pope and what the priest said so seriously that, they're willing to live, die, fight, whatever for that. And if the Pope says, you get a free pass, they get a free pass. They're not even in question. Which, there's good and bad about this. The good is, wow, faith. The bad is, wow, devastation of an entire, continent. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Pat, no, Stuart? Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
Titles named?
So, and then, obviously it was political. It was more about land and money than it was religion. They dressed it up with Christianity.
Yep.
But, it wasn't that we just went down and picked on the Muslims. They had pushed all the way up and were stopped in Constantinople. Thomas the Hammer stopped them where?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons they marched across the land was defensive.
Yes.
To get the Muslims out.
Yes.
But then, of course, they took what they...
That's the thing.
Yeah.
Urban frames this as we're reconquering the Holy Land. He is also getting pressure from the Patriarch of Constantinople saying, hey, the Muslims are invading, we are in big trouble, help us. And a lot of these crusades are going to be motivated by the Byzantine Empire saying, we're in trouble, please help us. Plus, once you have, like, Thomas the Hammer set up in, you know, the Holy Land in Antioch under, you know, Crusader control and Acre under Crusader control, once they are stuck there and they get invaded by, pardon me, Arabs, they're also going to send letters home and be like, hey, help me out, back up my city, and now that's a bunch more armies going out this way to help with the Crusades. Like I want to stress, it wasn't for distinct crusades, it was like the 4 crusades had sort of strictly defined goals. But there's like a flood of people just going out that way all the time throughout this whole period. And, you know, sacking on their way. Sarah?
The one line that starts up in London,
Yes.
the third one, is that the same crusade, like with Richard the Lionheart and Prince John and Robin Hood?
Robin Hood.
Yes. That's the 3rd crusade, and that's definitely the next one I want to talk about, so I will totally use you as a script when we get there. Yeah, the 3rd crusade is one of the most famous ones because it has a lot of big popular players. Obviously, King Richard the Lionhearted is a big player on this one. He sails around all of Spain with all of his army to go and help the Crusaders. The other big player in this one is Frederick Barbarossa, who is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He goes with his huge Holy Roman Emperor army, complete with Templars, and they all sail out as well. It is this grand, glorious adventure. The reason why they're going on this particular grand, glorious adventure is because Jerusalem has fallen at this point. After the Second Crusade, Saladin, the great Arab general, reconquers Jerusalem and a lot of this territory. So the Third Crusade is mustered to push him back. Because once again, he's encroaching on the Byzantines, he's encroaching on what was Crusader-held territory. It's time to push the infidel back into the sea. Unfortunately, Saladin was a way better stand-up guy than most of the Crusaders you're going to run into. Like, read about Saladin sometime. He was a really cool dude. And then you get Richard the Lionhearted and Frederick Barbarossa landing on these shores. And Barbarossa, goes bathing in the river and drowns. Because he goes in full armor and doesn't realize how deep it is. And the whole thing, rapidly deteriorates. To the point that, they get pushed immediately out of all of this territory. They have to run home with their tails between their legs. But worst of all, Richard the Lionhearted is on his way back home. He gets captured by the French, and they ransom him back to England. Because France just does this at this point in time. And France and England have been enemies for a long period of time. It's only going to get worse. But yeah, the whole Third Crusade is a giant mess. And if anything, it's only made worse when the Fourth Crusade happens. Because the Fourth Crusade is another, hey, let's defend Constantinople, let's retake Jerusalem and retake the Holy Land, which we had for a good solid 100 years there. The Pope is behind it, everybody's behind it, the Crusaders all get there, and they're like, you know what would be way better? If we conquered Constantinople. They basically let us in, so we'll just loot the place and sack it, and then they do. And that's the end of the Byzantine Empire. Fourth Crusade backfires horribly on the Byzantines. So, again, this is a giant mess, start to finish. It starts with a giant mess, it ends with a giant mess, and we didn't even talk about the Children's Crusade, where all the 10-year-olds get together and they're like, we're gonna retake the Holy Land because God is behind us, and they all end up dead or enslaved. Every last one of them, estimates of hundreds of thousands of children at some cases. It was a giant mess, start to finish. But at the same time as the Crusades in the Arab world are happening, there's also a push in Spain, the Reconquista. And you'll notice this fancy multicolored map of Spain. The reason why it's multicolored is because each color represents a stage of conquest. Over a good solid 2, 3, even more years, gradually Spain is reconquered by Christianity from the Islamic world. That's why, when they conquered Toledo, now we've got the Aristotelian texts, and we can start translating them again. This is a very slow, gradual process. The Crusades often participate in this, during, I think, the second and in between various named Crusades. Frequently, the Pope is like, hey, everybody, let's go fight in Spain some more, and they conquer a little bit more territory. Because at this point, the Arab Empire is way too stretched out to be able to back this up, as powerful as the lords in Spain actually are. So while that is happening in, Jerusalem and Constantinople, we also have Spain being gradually reconquered. But, since I imagine you can't see it, The deepest held territories of Spain, like this purple territory and this pink territory, those will not get conquered until the 15th century. So that's way in advance of what we're talking about. We are like, the conquest of Toledo is this yellow territory, and that's circa 1100. That's when we get the Aristotelian texts. So it is a long period of time. And in fact, the deep purple territory, that's not conquered until 1492. That's for named Isabella, also famous for Christopher Columbus. But we'll get there, not next week, but whenever we do the second half of this class, because that's a whole other conversation in a very different time period. Any other questions about the Crusades or any of these wars against Islam generally? All right, then the last thing I really want to sort of talk about before we call it for today is, as much as this has been a giant mess, there's already a push to change it. The Catholic Church has received a lot of push from the monks, especially to reform all the bad stuff that has been going on during all of this time. And increasingly, popes are coming from monasteries, rather than from that whole giant mess that is the Italian, nepotism, ugly, corrupt, ridiculousness. One of the things that you will see that the monks are constantly pressuring the popes about is this practice called simony, which is basically buying yourself a bishopric. This is happening all over the place. Like I talked about corrupt abbots and corrupt priests and corrupt popes, but this is global in the church at this point in time. Again, if you are a powerful lord in the area and you've got some unwanted son who's going to muck up your inheritance, typically what you will do is you will install them in a church. Gets them out of your hair, means they're not going to be fighting any of your other sons. So what you will do is you'll go over to the bishop of that church and be like, all right, bishop, how much do I have to pay you to make sure that my son is the next bishop? And the bishop will be like, and they'll write out a deal and they'll come up with a number and everything will change hands and all will be well. This is not how it's supposed to work, but the obvious incentives here, people like money, it's a thing. So this is happening all over the place. The temptation is very great, especially with the monasteries under pressure from other forces like the Viking raids and other things. So simony is widespread, and the monks aren't having it anymore. Remember, the monastic society, they'll accept anyone. There is no nepotism policy. Abbots choose abbots, and nothing can influence them because they've got their land. They don't need to worry about their liege lords so much. They're not political players in this whole thing. So they're very much pushing back against the secular forces that are sort of infringing upon the ecclesiastical world. The other thing that they're very much upset about, which is a very monk thing, is they're stressing we want celibacy for the priests and for the popes. Anyone who is in the whole Catholic ecclesiastical structure, we want them to be celibate, like the monks are. It works for the monks, it should work for them. Keep in mind, up until this point, popes have been marrying, popes have been having kids, priests and bishops are marrying, they're having kids, and because this is the medieval world, marriage is an economic transaction. You are making allies when you take a wife, which means this is once again bribery, corruption, power structures, money, all of that coming into this structure. So the monks have a decent argument here. This is not marriage in the same sense that we think of marriage today. But I do want to stress this because, especially because this particular issue is coming back to Catholicism today, and a lot of people are clamoring, just let the priests marry! This is a 1,000-year-old doctrine. It's not something that's going to just immediately get overturned by the Pope, as much as he may have the authority to do so. There are strong reasons why this was the case, and while some of those reasons have sort of vanished in the disappearance of feudalism, Christianity is supposed to survive any weird economic changes. So any decision that is made about the future of the church and the way that the ecclesiastical prelates are going to conduct themselves is supposed to have major, possibly millennia-long consequences. The church knows this. As much as the Catholics do a lot of things that we disagree with, they've been around for a long time, and they will probably be here long after our denominations have vanished at this rate. Though our denominations and faiths will most likely crop up in new ways and in new forms, I want to say. Sorry, Pastor, I saw that look.
They're running out of priests.
Yeah. I imagine that a lot of reform is going to be necessary no matter what they do, but Suffice it to say, this is an old idea. It's been around a while. And you'll remember, even as early as like Tertullian and Irenaeus and Origen, they were kicking that idea around back in like 200, 300 AD. This is not new. It's just now, it might actually be a thing that happens. And in this case, it actually will. Now, as I stressed, a lot of the new popes are becoming, or ex-monks at this point. And the one that I really want to stress, like the big change that really occurs at this moment in time that really does affect the way that the Catholic structure works, is the Second Lateran Council. We're not going to cover all the Lateran Councils. We are going to cover 2 because it's important, and we're going to cover 4 because it's so important next week. But Lateran Council 2 in 1059 is the one that decides we are now going to elect popes. All the cardinals who are also bishops, all the cardinals who are like high-ranking in the church, theologically or otherwise, who have the pope's ear, who are also the leaders of their own see, they are the ones who are going to get together and decide who the pope is. No more of this nepotism nonsense, no more pope picks the next pope. Not going to have it, too subject to corruption. Let's do this quasi-democratically, and this is where we get this whole cardinal election system.
Is that when there were 3 popes? And they
No.
got rid of all 3 of them and elected?
No, that's for next week. We will talk about the Avignon papacy next time. In fact, that was a product of this. What's weird about the Avignon papacy is it's the first time the cardinals all agreed, but then the cardinals all decided to change their minds. So, we'll get there. So anyway, new system, and this system is a lot more defensible. This works a lot better. But also, weirdly, one of the first beneficiaries of this system does it backwards. Gregory VII used to be a monk named Hildebrand. Hildebrand was a hardcore reform monk. He wanted to change the papacy. He wanted to change the ecclesiastical structure. And he was so popular among his fellow monks, among the abbots, and among the people that when all of a sudden the cardinals are getting together and decide who the next pope is, the people are clamoring for Gregory, or Hildebrand, and the cardinals listen to them. So as much as it is the cardinals who ultimately make the decision, the cardinals are kind of informed through the back door. So Hildebrand takes the new name, Gregory VII, and he accepts it from his mentor in 1073. And Gregory, again, very much a reform pope, very much trying to change the church to be more like monasticism, which will cause problems. So he convenes his own synod, and in this synod, he lays it down, we're going to have celibacy among priests from now on. That's the deal. No more popes getting married, no more priests getting married, no more bishops, no more cardinals. There's not going to be any sex in the Catholic prelate tradition. The ecclesiastical structure will be men only, no wives. The other thing he's going to stress is he is going to reject the sacraments performed by Simoniacs. And this should ring a bell, because you remember Augustine spoke about this with the Donatists, and he said, it doesn't matter who performs the sacrament holds, because Jesus was there, and Jesus is the only one who counts. For Pope Gregory to overturn this is pretty much a direct attack against all the Simoniacs at this time. He is basically saying, we are not going to tolerate this anymore, even if it means going against what is theologically accepted at this point in time. So he is basically declaring war on anyone who bought their bishopric. And as you expect, everyone gets mad about this. Specifically, the Holy Roman Emperor at this time is a guy named Henry IV, not to be confused with the English King Henry IV, of which Shakespeare wrote his big play about. Totally different Henry IV, and the two of these guys very much butt heads. Henry IV has bought a fair share of his bishops at this point in time, but he's actually got a reason for it. See, the issue here is less to do with like reform and what the papacy should look like, as how much power, secular power, should the church wield. See, Henry IV is a king. Like any other king, he's got all his vassals. But remember, bishops have land. They have peasants. They have vassals. They have knights. Which means that if you are Henry IV and you are currently waging a fierce war against France, you need to have everybody in your kingdom on your side. Last thing you want is some random bishop letting the Austrians in the door behind you because they're more sympathetic to the Austrians than they are to you. So Henry IV bought his bishops for a reason. He needs to have a united state. Now, for the Pope to say none of those bishops count, Henry's tearing his hair out like, how do I defend myself? What if the bishop doesn't like me? Because this has major real-world consequences. This means that he cannot wage war effectively because he might have traitors in his midst. So when Gregory says this, Henry reacts. He steals into the city of Rome while Gregory is performing mass, and they kidnap him. It's a pretty effective way to get change done. You kidnap the leader of the change. Unfortunately, his band of kidnappers gets stopped at the door, and the people are so mad, remember Gregory's super popular, that they all lay siege to the basilica and refuse to let Henry or Gregory or any of the participants out. So Gregory, now liberated from Henry's control, pronounces interdict on the entire Holy Roman Empire. None of your sacraments count. Henry cannot participate in any holy ceremonies of any kind. He will not receive communion. You were all effectively excommunicated until further notice. Which, again, surprisingly, makes everyone mad. So Henry just takes over Rome. He just takes over the place. He's just going to conquer it. Like, I'm just going to put this whole thing to rest. And Gregory has to flee the city, and they write nasty letters to each other. Gregory does not let him out of interdict until finally they come to like an uneasy peace. It's an ugly, ugly situation. Finally, they resolve it, but it just flares up again a little while later between Henry IV's, not son, I think it's his grandson, Henry V, and Pope Pascal II. And these guys actually are able to communicate their ideas. Henry V makes it clear the problem here is not with, like, what do we want the ideal scripture to say? Absolutely, yeah, sure, we do not want, like, people buying their positions. Granted. But if bishops and priests are going to wield political power, they need to be subject to their political leaders as well as to their ecclesiastical leaders. So between the two of them, they managed to hash out a pretty decent compromise. Henry says, take away the land. The land is what's making the money, so we'll just have bishops not own land anymore. They will retain their ecclesiastical power. They will still obviously retain all their spiritual authority as given to them by their bishops, their cardinals, their popes. They will still be the religious leaders. They will just not be political leaders. I no longer have to worry about this bishop stabbing me in the back because my bishop cannot muster an army anymore, which sounds fairly reasonable. Pascal is on board with this. Okay, let's change the situation. The papacy will retain its rights. Those were well stated long ago in those forged documents or possibly forged documents. The bishops, the priests, they will give up their lands, their holdings, and they will get all their money straight to the Pope, which they will receive through the tithes and all that fun stuff. Sounds like a deal. Everybody freaks out. Like, everybody freaks out. All of Henry's subjects revolt because they are incensed at the prospect that now the monasteries and the bishops cannot support themselves. On the flip side, you have all the priests absolutely losing it against Pascal because they have literally just been stripped of all of their wealth and all of their prosperity. This is not going to fly. Obviously, this is not going to work. Nobody on the ground level can accept this compromise. So finally, we get the Concordat of Worms, which is where we will get the best solution we're going to see for a little while, although, you know, surprise, history keeps moving and everything gets messed up again. In 1122, at the Concordat of Worms, we decide on this compromise. First, all of the ecclesiastical authority, all of the spiritual authority, all the religious authority that any bishop or priest receives, they will get directly from the Pope and the whole ecclesiastical hierarchy. However, all of their political authority they will receive from whoever their king or major liege lord is. This basically boils down to we have to agree on who our bishop is going to be. Everybody has veto power in this situation. If Henry V has this new bishop and he's like, I love this guy, he is totally my friend, he will totally back me up on campaigns, everything is great, he is not going to fight against my arguments, then he will bring him forward and say, hey, let's make this guy a bishop. And the church will say, okay, we're going to check his theology, and we're going to read through all of his papers, and we're going to see what he had to write about the sentences, and if he checks out, then he will be a bishop. But if he doesn't, the church will say no, and Henry has to come up with somebody else, or the church will come up with somebody else of their own. Likewise, if the church says, hey, we've got this monk, he wants to be a bishop, we think that he's a really good theologian, he totally fits the job, let's put him in this particular parish, they will talk to whoever the king is, and the king will say, that guy, we've had problems with his family in the past, I veto this. And it's done. That guy cannot be a bishop. Everyone has to agree. If he's going to have secular authority, he's going to receive it from the secular authorities above him. If he's going to have ecclesiastical authority, he's going to receive it from the ecclesiastical authorities. The symbol here, the church gives the ring and the crozier, but the scepter is handed down from the emperor or the king. That's how it's going to work. In order to be a bishop, in order to have both the land and the ecclesiastical authority, you need all of these things. You can only get them if everyone agrees. Surprise, this doesn't work. But at least it will be a slower burn, and this one will work way better than the system that we've had up until this point. This shows that the reform is happening, change is coming, it may not be coming fast enough, and it may be too little too late. Questions before we call it for today? I know I held everyone way too late. I'm so sorry, there's just so much during this period. All right, next week we're going to talk about the 13th and the 14th century. We're going to work our way all the way up to the Renaissance. We will talk about the Avignon craziness, and we're going to talk about all of the popes and anti-popes. We're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas, the great theologians of the Scholastic period. It's going to be great, and I will try and not go quite so far over time, but no